Where's Kathy? Here you are. Kathy, thank you for your phone call and inviting me to be here tonight. I'm not giving a keynote address. She's invited me to tell my story, and I said, well, don't you have some newer stories? You know, I've got an old story. She says, yeah, but, you know, they want to hear your story. And I said, does that mean it's the worst story? Great. Well, so anyway, but thank you for inviting me. And thank you, everyone, for showing up for Charles. And Charles, I'll get to you on the last page. Well, I grew up in the Episcopal Church. That means infant baptism, Sunday school, vacation Bible school. I memorized the Nicene Creed before it was required for teenage confirmation. I wore hats, white gloves, and a crinoline slip under my Sunday dresses, except on Christmas when I wore my brand new 6-gun shooters. Father West was my growing up priest, and somehow I knew he loved me in a way that was profound and forever and different than the other ways I was loved as a child. My memories of church are very, very good. The kind of good that helps to grow us up so that we want what is good for others when we're adults. I'm now a newly retired priest in the Episcopal Church as of June 26th, and the former rector of a parish in Washington, D.C., which included children who stand on the wood box by the altar on Sundays so they can see during the celebration of Holy Communion, hopefully learning in the process some of what formed me into the person that I am. I've been ordained for 18 years following my first vocation in education. I began my professional life as a junior high school teacher and then earned a PhD in health sciences, only eventually to leave a solid career as a university department chair and professor in order to go to seminary and pursue ordination. Life has been good to me. Not perfect. As we all know, that life is never without its ups and downs. And like most folks I know, I've had my share. I've tasted bits and pieces of injustice, especially as a girl who grew up as an aspiring athlete before Title IX. These also include being intentionally hit by a pickup truck during graduate school in Illinois and being left for dead in a snowbank. Through it all, the church, however, was the place that told me unequivocally that I was a person of value and that God loved me no matter what. And then one day in 2002, actually I just figured out there, 14 years ago and 1 month today, I was crushed. Without warning, the church that grew me up turned on me, and I experienced a cruelty at the hands of my church that was as painful as living through being the victim of the truck hit and run years ago. But this was different and more devastating than my previous brush with death. It was a Wednesday morning, 7 o'clock, October 2nd. I was the associate rector in my 4th year of ordained ministry in a program-sized church. And each week, the rector, the senior minister, and I met with the 2 senior lay leaders of the congregation. On this morning, the rector cleared his throat and said, "Nancy Lee, I have something very hard to say to you." He took a long pause. "We want you to resign." And I can say that as I stand here and say those words and recall that morning, my chest is getting tight again. And that moment occasionally still hovers as a bad dream. I don't want to resign. I remember stammering, my childhood stuttering, coming back to haunt those vicious moments. You don't have a choice. It would be better for you if you resign rather than, and left the silent option dangling in the air. Swiftly, numerous unrecognizable accusations were laid out like a good hand of poker. I was allowed no defense. There was no process of appeal. I was simply told that I was no longer wanted, that I had nothing more to offer, and that contact with my parishioners, including the youth group I had just accompanied on a mission trip to Navajo Nation, was, as of that moment, terminated. You should consider returning to teaching or something. You should never have been a parish priest, said the man who, up until that morning, I had considered my colleague in ministry. These were the last words spoken to me before I was told to turn in my keys, to leave the building within 30 minutes and without packing up anything from the office, and never to return to the property again. I got up and I walked the 20 feet down the hall to my office. I stood there looking out the window, then at my books, lining shelf after shelf, filled with assiduously highlighted pages and notes in the margins, then my desk, my appointment book, open and filled in with the names of people with whom I was in holy relationship with, for I was their priest, and I loved them, and I still do. Across the hall was the office of the youth director whom I admired and had mentored. I gazed at her door, and I left by the back steps. I got in my car and somehow drove to the Dyson headquarters and walked into the office of what we call the canon to the ordinary, the bishop's chief assistant. She got up and looked at my face and simply said, "He did it." And as I sat there, stunned to know the rector had already announced to others his intention to find a way to get rid of me, the fax machine in her office piped up with a release statement for me to sign, purchasing my silence in exchange for a small financial severance package. Many, I learned later, don't even receive that. I have been told that the vestry, which is the board of the Episcopal parish, had voted unanimously to ask me to leave. Although later I was discovered that the first they heard of my departure was when the rector later announced my sudden resignation. The parish was told that I had left abruptly and unexpectedly, in effect abandoning them without warning. I was not allowed to say goodbye to staff, vestry, to the children and youth who were brutally blindsided by the news. And I was not the only one never to go back. The families of several children and teens were to leave the parish in the outrage over my brutal mistreatment and their own. And to this day, some of them have not been back to church, not just that church, but any church at all. It took months for the truth of what happened to slowly leak out, and then years for the parish to recover. I did eventually receive a personal apology from one of the two lay leaders who had been witness to my termination that morning, saying that he had been an unwilling participant who did not really understand or agree with what was being done, but felt he had no choice but to back the rector's unexpected unilateral announcement of my departure. Years later, I dared to go back to St. Paul's and attend the funeral of the beloved member of a parish, and one of the vestry members who had served during my termination asked to speak to me after the service. He pulled me over and he hugged me tightly and began weeping uncontrollably. He asked for my forgiveness and apologized for not having stood up for me, a grown man, a Naval Academy graduate and officer, successful in every worldly way, blindsided by betrayal. I have never seen nor heard from the rector since that morning. Soon afterwards, he left that parish himself for a church on the West Coast, from which he subsequently resigned. He turned up selling high-end real estate in Southern California, following what his new website describes as a 12-year sojourn in the nonprofit world. I have no direct knowledge of what happened in his last parish, other than the fact that both he and his new assistant vanished from their church website one week, and several years later, the church still had not hired a permanent rector. In the days, weeks, and months that followed my termination, I spent hours and hours sitting in silence, feeling empty, broken, beaten, and beaten up. I took a financial hit that I'll never fully recover from, having to sell my house and exhaust my savings. I was treated for post-traumatic stress and slowly nursed back to health with the love of my family, friends, former parishioners who still believed in my calling, the man who was to become my husband, the very handsome Dr. Wayne Whitson Floyd right over there, and some courageous colleagues, including a retired Episcopal bishop who encouraged me to read, mark, and inwardly digest everything I could get my hands on about family systems, workplace bullying, and narcissistic personality disorders. 2 phone calls were pivotal in my recovery. The first was from a priest whom I knew only indirectly, but who had suffered his own indignities at the hands of my former boss. Nearing retirement, he was serving a loving family-sized parish nearby. And he told me that he was determined that my termination was not going to mean losing my vocation as a priest. So he offered to split his already small salary with me if I would come to serve with him at his rural colonial-era Episcopal church in Virginia. I did, working weekly with this gentle soul who came at things from perspectives different enough from my own to put us on literally opposite sides of many difficult issues of that era. But we were yoked together as a team, plowing our field as faithfully as the two of us knew how. I was to follow him as interim rector there as I began my search for the next phase of my journey in ministry. If Chris's call helped to save my vocation, a call from Bev Buston, a member of MTM's board of directors, saved my soul. She invited me to a week-long retreat for persons who had been involuntarily terminated, and somehow convinced me in the midst of my pain and shame to attend. It hurt to have been reduced to that, someone terminated against my will, to be fired for who you are, with no sense that anything I could have done would have made a difference. There is no way to make sense of how to fire the priest in you. You cannot extinguish a sacrament. Ordination for Episcopal clergy is for life, even though you can cease to practice the activities of ministering. The whole situation I had been thrust into felt dirty. I felt ashamed and humiliated, but I went. And there I heard the stories of my mostly Protestant brothers on retreat with me. We listened and talked, and then carried each other's stories to our rooms, to our prayers, tasting and sharing our common emotions of rage and betrayal, our experiences of abandonment, dreams stomped into dust, personal narratives that had been obliterated. And then one day there was the slightest glimmer of hope, and I actually slept for the first time in quite a while for 4 straight hours. And slowly I felt the murmuring of prayer bubbling up from that once familiar place, and I saw the face of Christ in those on retreat with me who had suffered much and who still loved God as I did, who still wanted to love others in the name of God as I did. And we took together our first steps towards reclaiming our lifelong callings while being massaged with the palpable wisdom and compassion of the MTM retreat leaders, teachers, and guides. Some of you in this room were among those who saved my life. And because of all these people, I learned to begin to trust that God loved us all no matter what, and wasn't finished with any of us yet. My hope is that others of you who have found healing like this will find encouragement and courage to share your own stories, reclaiming the narrative of your call so others may be saved from despair and by the grace of God find again their vocational paths as ministers of God who is making all things new. In closing, I thought that this particular gathering might like to know that for 5 years I served Baylor University in Waco, Texas as a health sciences department chair and professor. I must say my first year there was rather rough. I was indeed a foreigner in what was for me a foreign land. The department I inherited was all men, all from Texas, all Southern Baptists, all married, and all of whom had been teaching there for quite a while. The youngest one, closest to me in age, was 15 years older than I was. I was in my early 30s, single, and probably the only Episcopalian they'd lay eyes on from the East Coast. Most of them had never experienced one. You don't tell Episcopal female preachers what to say in their sermons either. The colleague closest to my age was 15 years older, and I was hired to be their boss and bring in a new department curriculum within 6 months. And so I did, learning a lot of things in the process the harder way. However, once that year was behind me, I was discover at Baylor and more broadly in Waco a whole culture of people who never asked, do you go to church, but rather, where do you go to church? The culture of Baylor University at that time in the mid and late 80s was a place that visibly and palpably lived a notion of generous hospitality in which we cared for one another, sometimes at the costly expense of ourselves. And it remains for me the kind of place I still long to be as a neighbor, especially now as newly retired. I still recall the first time I was sitting outside with a student and a very old, bent-over woman, umbrella in hand, blocking the sun, walked by. I asked my student, "Who is that?" "Oh, her, that's Dr. Smith. She taught English here a long time ago. She now checks our library cards, and the school provides a home for her over there." Mrs., actually Dr. Smith, never married, had given her time, talents, and money to Baylor over the course of a lifetime. And indeed, Baylor, now without batting an eye, quite naturally had undertaken the care of Dr. Smith until her death. This was their culture, and this is where I learned one of my lessons about the meeting of God's abundant care for our neighbor. For me, the intersection of my forced termination and my experience of Baylor was the beginning place for me to learn to address the catastrophic numbers of forced terminations across denominations. We all make mistakes, including some really big ones, and I've been a thorn in people's sides and have had my share of fierce disagreements. However, the intrusion of the worst sort of competitive and cutthroat corporate business values into our houses of worship is a source of idolatry and direct conflict with the godly call to respect the dignity and humanity of all persons. Perhaps this evening can initiate the conversation in your own churches of reconciliation where needed, how to address church conflict and prevent escalating circumstances, as well as an invitation to continue to support the good work that Charles Chandler began with the founding of MTM and the ability to flourish in the years to come. None of what happened during my miracle with MTM would have occurred if it hadn't been for you, Charles. I believe that Charles Chandler had an inspired vision of resurrection healing, restoring fragments of broken humanity to wholeness. He took a vision of what could be to what we see now. MTM retreats, a non-judgmental sanctuary for persons broken up and broken down. MTM, through ongoing visionary programmatic development, has prayer by prayer, heart by heart, helped hundreds of us to stand up again, look up and see the face of Christ in the other, and proclaim, "Here I am, Lord, send me again." Charles, it's a momentous thing for anyone ever to save just one life. It is courageous faithfulness in the face of overwhelming odds to save hundreds. May our prayers for you and your good retirement be as faithful. I love you dearly. You saved my life.